Have you ever judged someone just by the way they lived? Maybe by the house they owned, the clothes they wore, or the car they drove? Well, in this story, an entire neighborhood laughed at one man for living in the poorest, most broken down house on the street. But what none of them knew was that behind those cracked walls and peeling paint lay a truth that would humble them all. And when one stranger finally spoke up, the laughter turned into silence and respect. Stick around, because this is the kind of story that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about appearances. The neighborhood was a picture of wealth. Neatly trimmed hedges, cars that glistened in the sunlight, children playing on wide driveways, and homes that looked like they had been plucked straight out of a magazine. But right in the middle of all this perfection stood one house that didn't fit the picture. The roof sagged, the windows were old, the paint was chipped, and weeds grew around the gate. It was the kind of place that instantly drew whispers. And inside that house lived an older man named Jacob. Jacob wasn't flashy. He didn't wear expensive clothes. He didn't drive a luxury car, in fact. He rarely drove at all. Most days, he could be seen walking to the local store with a worn canvas bag, returning with just the essentials. The neighbors noticed. They noticed everything. They mocked him quietly at first, comments about how his house dragged down the property value, jokes about how he didn't fit in with the rest of the street. But over time, the whispers grew louder, bolder, and crueler. Children would laugh as they passed his fence, and parents did little to stop them. To everyone else, Jacob was the man who lived in that house. But what no one knew was that Jacob had a past far richer than any of them could imagine. One summer evening, as the neighborhood gathered for a block party, the jokes about Jacob were at their peak. People pointed at his cracked windows, laughed about his overgrown lawn, and even said someone should just tear it down. Jacob, as usual, stayed quiet. He never defended himself, never explained, never fought back. He simply nodded politely when spoken to and returned to his home. But on that day, a man no one had seen before stood up for him. The man, sharply dressed but with kind eyes, stepped into the circle of laughter and asked a simple question. Do any of you actually know who he is? The crowd went quiet for a moment, confused. Then came the smirks. He's just some old man who won't fix his house, one of them said. But the stranger shook his head. That man, he said, pointing to Jacob's weathered house, saved more lives than anyone here will in a lifetime. The crowd fell silent. The stranger went on. He told them how Jacob had once been a decorated surgeon, working in war zones and disaster areas, saving people when no one else would. For years, he had volunteered his time, refusing huge salaries, traveling wherever he was needed most. He had saved hundreds of lives, men, women, and children, while risking his own safety. The stranger revealed that Jacob had given away most of his wealth to fund clinics, schools, and orphanages in countries torn apart by war. That house you laugh at, the stranger said firmly. It looks the way it does because he gave away what he had, so others could have more. The neighbors stood frozen. All those years, they had mocked a man who had lived more nobly and selflessly than any of them could imagine. But the story didn't end there. The stranger then revealed his own connection. I wouldn't even be standing here if it weren't for him. When I was a boy, trapped in a collapsed building during a bombing, Jacob was the doctor who pulled me out and patched me up. He saved my life. That's why I'm here today, to make sure you all know the truth about the man you've been mocking. Gasps filled the air. The children who had laughed now stared at Jacob's house with new eyes. The adults, who had once smirked, now looked ashamed. Suddenly, the peeling paint and sagging roof didn't look like a sign of weakness. It looked like a badge of sacrifice. From that day on, the neighborhood changed. People began visiting Jacob, offering help with repairs, bringing meals, and most importantly, showing respect. Children who once mocked now waved cheerfully when they saw him. The man who had once been invisible, laughed at, and dismissed was finally recognized for who he truly was, a hero who had quietly given everything so others could have a chance at life. And Jacob? He never bragged, never gloated, never reminded anyone of the way they had treated him. He simply smiled, thanked the stranger who had spoken up, and returned to his quiet life. His house might have been the poorest on the street, but Jacob was the richest man among them all. So the next time you're tempted to judge someone by what they own, where they live, or how they look, remember this story. Behind the poorest house, the simplest clothes, or the quietest person might lie a life full of sacrifice, courage, and extraordinary kindness. Because sometimes the people who seem to have the least are the ones who've given the most. If this story moved you, make sure to hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us of the value of compassion over judgment. And remember, true wealth isn't measured by what we keep, it's measured by what we give.